We started with a discussion on human behavior and what we know about motivating pro-social behavior in a little bit of an abstract sense. Tried to tie that into trust and safety. The second session, and each of these sessions, responds to recall the three pillars of our approach. So part of it is about the social science of behavior. A second is about procedural justice, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more. And then the third part is going to be about what are some of the challenges in building in an organization or building teams that work effectively with each other, with this recognition that people are building products, people are creating policies. How do we make those two work? So that's where we'll be going a little bit later in this afternoon, and this is the second of our conversations that we're having. And we'll go for probably around the same amount of time, hour and change, and then Matt will come back after we've had a conversation with Tracey and Tom, doing the second part of each of these sessions, which is to tie it specifically into some trust and safety issues that arise. So again, just anytime you need to reach us, just chat, hit us up on chat, and we're going to ask Tracey and Tom to come in. And just note that if you'll be hearing me, it's only because we have a literally limited space and to sit and get everyone on camera. So we're going to have an informal session where I'm going to ask them some questions, and I'll be off camera, a little bit of a disembodied voice, but that's a format that we're going to use. So we're not going to have a lot of slides until the very end, and we're going to make it an open conversation for this second format. Maybe I'll start with just introductions. So, Tracey, do you want to?
Sure. I'm Tracey Meares. I am a professor at Yale Law School, and together with this guy, I co-founded and co-direct the Justice Collaboratory.
I'm Tom Tyler. I'm a professor at Yale Law School. I'm also a co-founder of the Justice Collaboratory together with Tracey Meares. And I think the distinction between us for your purposes is I'm a psychologist and Tracey's a lawyer. We both do empirical research, but our backgrounds are a little different.
Yes, I just play a social scientist on TV.
Tracey, what is the Justice Collaboratory? Where did the inspiration come from? And how did you and Tom put this together, and why?
So the Justice Collaboratory today is a collection of the premier scholars of justice from a number of different fields: psychology, political science, philosophy, law, sociology, etc. And our motivation for doing it, like 6 years ago now, maybe, Tom, 6, 7, was that we noticed that people working in the criminal legal system space, which was our initial impetus for doing this kind of work, did one of two things. They either provided technical assistance to agencies, like policing agencies, prosecutors, and so on, or they did something like program evaluation, did a particular intervention work, and I use that term advisedly. But what there didn't seem to be was a place where people were actually developing high quality, serious science. So our initial motto was serious science, serious impact, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit about what we mean by serious impact. And so what we wanted to do was bring together people from a number of different disciplines who are working on these questions from different perspectives and create a place for us to learn from each other and advance the science together. That was our motivation.
Tom, what's the kind of general challenge of combining your disciplinary perspective with in a law school and with that way of looking at the world, and if that makes you think of some of the challenges online, great, but we're just curious to know how this collaboration would be possible in the law school, and why. Why does it help us understand?
Well, the thing that's interesting about a psychologist, or really any social scientist teaching in a law school, is that the law generally is not based on social science research. Now, a lot of the assumptions of law are based upon naive, popular, common sense views about human nature, but not research-based findings about how people behave and some of the issues that Sudhir and Matt brought up this morning. Why do people follow rules? Why do they help others? So we have a system that thinks it's based upon behavioral science, but not really based upon systematic behavioral science research. So I think the first challenge for somebody in my position is to try to convince the legal community that they should base what they do on evidence, and that they should want to have evidence. They should seek evidence, and then they should use it to make policy and create law. The other thing about law is that it, based to the degree that people do think about human nature a lot on a kind of a naive economic view of people. People want to win, people want desirable outcomes, people fear punishment. And so there's a kind of reflective model there that comes from a very sort of, to a social scientist, very simple view of what motivates people, what people care about. And then that creates the problem that people reflexively take those ideas and they default to a force-based solution in a lot of areas of criminal law, like sanctioning, deterrence, when, as we'll be telling you in the next hour, we think other solutions are actually superior. So there's convincing people to base policy on evidence, and then there's convincing them that there's other models besides, let's say, an economic model of the rational actor
That will help them achieve their goals.
that will help them achieve their goals, yeah.
How did you encounter this? How did you develop it?
Yeah.
Where's some of the origins before we dive into the online?
Yeah, so Tom and I were talking about this earlier in preparation for this. Tom's just a little bit older than I am.
Just a little.
Just a little. And when I began teaching law in 1994, I was influenced by our mentor, Sudhir, William Julius Wilson, again bringing a social science perspective to the law, how to understand the ways in which legal policy could be influenced by sociology. At the time, law was heavily influenced by a kind of the law and economics approach that didn't take into account how people who actually weren't involved in a particular transaction. So by that I mean, let's say a person who's breaking the law and their victim. That's pretty much the way that the law was looking at it. And by using a sociological perspective, you could see how what you might call in the law third-party others, outside groups, could play an incredibly important role in influencing how effective some kind of legal policy could be. So that was a sociological work I was working on, thinking about violence reduction. And doing that work in 1994, I came across this book that this guy named Tom Tyler had written called Why People Obey the Law, which was published in 1990. There was not a single law professor who had cited Tom Tyler in 1990 in law reviews. I'm going to leave aside Law and Society or Journal of Legal Studies or something like that. And I cited Tom, bringing that perspective in, the idea that people could be motivated to obey the law, not because they feared the consequences of failing to do so, but because they were internally motivated because of social, psychological perspective. So that's what brought me to procedural justice, and diving into the research, it became an incredibly powerful framework for not only understanding just a general proposition about how people might follow the law or rules, but also responded to a very pressing concern in the 90s, which was the ways in which there was an escalation in imprisonment, and that we could actually achieve the goals of having people live in safer communities without having the negative impact of punitive policies, which had a very distinct racial consequence. And that was a question that I, along with others, I think you at the time, our colleague Mary Patilla, we were all sort of focusing on that question. And Tom's research was key in helping me sort of find a path out of those negative consequences.
And where were some of the initial, either of you, where were some of the initial applications of procedural justice for you in a research capacity where you felt like this perspective on how people understand the law actually makes them cooperate better, feel like the system is working better for them? Where were some of those initial, in what context did you gain some of those initial insights, I imagine, well before the digital platforms of today were created?
You're a court-based work.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I think for me, the start was really working with the courts. And there, early on in my career, I was a researcher part-time at the American Bar Foundation, which is the research arm of the American Bar Association in Chicago. And judges came to us because of their concern about the failure of people to follow court orders. And essentially that's a question of authority, like we're talking about today with social media. You have a set of decisions, you have a set of rules, and people weren't following them. So you could go to court and you could get a court order, someone owed you money or a child custody issue, and the party that didn't like the outcome would ignore it and wouldn't follow it. So I first started being drawn into the system through the court system and working. I think one of the big things that has come out of that era of work is the alternative dispute resolution, the mediation movement, because Sudhir, as you're asking this about procedural justice, we discovered that people didn't think adjudication was fair. And so one important reason people weren't following court orders is they didn't experience their court procedures as being fair. And so looking at research on what people did want, we found that mediation, for example, was experienced by the parties as being fairer. And as a consequence of that, people were more willing to accept and follow whatever decisions got made. So that was an early application of the idea that a fair process, and by that we mean a process that the people involved experienced as being just, would lead to greater acceptance of a decision, greater willingness to follow the rules in the future. And that's the courts. Then we started subsequently to see a similar set of issues coming up in policing. And I'm going to just say that I think that Tracey was very instrumental in bringing these ideas into the arena of policing. My first serious involvement was in the 2004 National Academy of Sciences panel, where we talked about the concept of procedural justice, the concept of legitimacy in policing, and that's really Tracey. Tracey is the one who brought those ideas into that report. She's the one that convinced that panel that they're important. So maybe having said that, I'll push it over to Tracey.
Tom actually reminded me of this earlier today. This is a National Academy of Sciences report published in 2004. So Wes Gogan, who is a very well-known policing scholar, political scientist at Northwestern, was the chair of this National Academy of Sciences report, which was to put together a review of the evidence around policing. And there was a panel of all the leading policing researchers at the time. So David Weisberg, John Eck, Rob Warden was on it. I think Janet Lauritsen. I could go on of all of these people, and me. And I was a kid then. And at the time, people were really focused on ideas of applying deterrence to policing. The idea that, remember, we're coming off of a huge wave of violence in many cities. In 1999, early 2000, it's hard for people to remember now how high homicide levels were. And a lot of these researchers were pushing the ways in which you could deploy police officers geographically and bring crime down. And so this group of researchers then, and still today, I think is fair to say, were focused on what they would call effective policing. But I had read Tom Tyler, and I was convinced that people need to pay much more attention to ideas of legitimacy, how these legal authorities treated people so that they could comply through internal motivation. And this was also well before the stop, question, and frisk controversy in New York. Well, maybe the first one, because there were two waves, right? There was the New York Attorney General in 1999. In any case, so we convinced them to take this research seriously, and actually resulted in a title change, Fairness and Effectiveness in Policing. And that was in 2004. And that's really a precursor to my work on the President Obama's task force.
What are the components of procedural justice that are different or that were made in juxtaposition to the theory of deterrence?
So deterrence, very straightforward. The idea that people will comply with rules, obey the law, because they fear the consequences of failing to do so. Now, those consequences could be that you're arrested and that you, end up in prison, right? Or it could also be social consequences. So an example I like to use sometimes is I'm driving home from the library after a long day of work at Yale. It's 3 a.m. in New Haven, and no one's on the street. And then I stop at a red light. Why do I do that? It's not because I think a cop is coming. That would be the formal consequences. It's not a social consequence. My grandmother isn't standing on the corner telling me, I taught you better than that. Stop at the stoplight. It's because I think, it's the right thing to do, that I understand that my legal representatives have passed this law and I respect them, and I've internalized that rule. And that's what we call legitimacy-based compliance. And Tom can explain the components of legitimacy-based compliance, of which procedural justice is the foundation.
Well, I think that before I do that, I would just emphasize the degree to which, at the time that these ideas started to get more attention, it was just assumed by authorities that the reason that people followed rules, the reason that people accepted decisions by police officers or judges, was that they feared punishment.
Yeah.
And the idea that people could be appealed to by reference to their internal feelings of obligation and responsibility was something that was widely dismissed. So one of the things that we have done through our research is we've demonstrated that people's feelings of responsibility and obligation, their sense of the legitimacy of authorities, is important in what they do. That gets us to the second idea, and that is the procedural justice idea. Having said that legitimacy is important, then the question is, why do people think an authority is legitimate?
Right.
And that's the other key point. People evaluate authorities by looking at the fairness of the way that those authorities make decisions and treat people. Again, there's this kind of implicit self-interest model that a lot of people have, that people react to an authority by the favorability of the outcome they get from that authority. So if you win in court, you like the judge. If you lose, you hate the judge. And the research shows that that's really not correct. That the main thing that both winners and losers focus on when they react to some decision, judge, police officer, is, did that person make that decision through procedures that I think are fair? And we know the 4 things that people consider when they make that judgment. Did they get a voice? Were they allowed to state their case or make their arguments? Did they feel that the decision maker was neutral? So was there transparency so that they could see that rules were followed, bias was not involved, evidence was used? Were they treated with dignity and respect when they were dealing with this person? And did they feel that the motives of the decision maker were benevolent? The person was trying to do the right thing for the people involved. Those four elements define the fairness or unfairness of a procedure. That's the most important issue, deciding the legitimacy of the decision maker. And then legitimacy shapes whether people follow rules, accept decisions. So that's the new model that basically we have been presenting through the courts and the police, and now more recently through discussions in prisons. But it's one core alternative model for thinking about how to design an authority system that, as Sudhir said this morning, can easily be extended to discussions about
Exactly.
online platforms.
You know, you touch on this idea that many just assume that this deterrence model
Yeah.
is the model. Like, people don't do things because they fear punishment, and this legitimacy thing is like kind of neither here nor there. It's not very important. This is something we encounter all the time with the companies we've talked
Yes.
to and platforms we work with, and I feel like I would be a lot better at my job if I knew why that is the de facto understanding, or like, and I assume that this is something you've thought about or have ideas about. Why is that people's kind of the way they approach most scenarios?
You know, this is a fascinating question. It's clear that that is true, that in almost every context that we have operated in, you know, whether we're talking about police, courts, prosecutors, our work with platforms, teachers, parents, people will assume that that's true. I think I would leave it to the psychologist to say a little bit more about why that's true. One thing I will say is that then this is important. Nothing that we've said today suggests that deterrence doesn't work. It can work. Our point is, going back to Tom's first answer to Sudhir, is that research shows that it's simply not as effective as the process-based procedural justice approach. And moreover, it can be counterproductive. Now that we see in policing all the time, an overinvestment in deterrence-based models can actually alienate people from authorities and can actually be what our friend Jeff Fagan calls iatrogenic. That is, you go to the hospital and you get sick. It actually is at cross purposes. But as for why, I don't know. Tom, do you know why people have such a hard time?
So it's a great question. Before I answer it, though, I do want to echo what Tracey said, because I do think this is something that we really need to make a central point to people who are considering this model. Sometimes people say, oh, we use deterrence to get compliance, and then we use legitimacy to get cooperation. That's not really a research finding. We see people complying with the law as often and as effectively as a strategy through legitimacy-based authority as through deterrence. So it does get you rule following, but it gets you other things too, like the benefits that Tracey was mentioning of a better atmosphere where people are more cooperative. Now, Matt, your question. I think that this goes back to what Sudhir asked us at the very beginning about the legal system, and I said is based upon a lot of common sense assumptions, conventional wisdom, folk beliefs, which maybe just pushes your question back one level, like why is it a folk belief that people are instrumental? But it's a product of our culture that people seem to believe that this is the way people are. And so it's ironic that people often think they're that way too. So if you say to someone, you're going to court, what do you want? And they say, well, I want to win. I'm a rational actor, I want to win. They come out of court, and what determines how they feel? Was it a fair procedure? So people themselves carry this cultural image of them. They're being rational actors in what they do. They judge other people in the same way. So it is this fundamental cultural assumption, and we keep saying, as Tracey just said, that there's a lot of evidence that's not true. So beyond just this particular instance of folk wisdom, we need to have all areas of law better interrogate what's true about human nature.
At the heart of this is a assumption that I know that I have felt working inside companies, and I hear a lot from people who work on companies, which is when I hear procedural justice, I feel like you're asking me to disclose a lot of the techniques and secrets and procedures, some of which I'm not even sure I can legally do, but certainly it puts me in a very uncomfortable position, because if people out there, all those bad people, know exactly how my platform works, they're just going to take advantage of me. I mean, so isn't it better if I hide? I mean, it feels like there's a lot of push here to be transparent and disclose, and I'm not convinced or I'm a little nervous about being transparent for all sorts of legal reasons, from legal to, I just am skeptical. Do you hear that in the online
Yes.
world? And
Definitely. Two answers. First, the fear that bad people will game the system is a pretty regular refrain that we hear. And again, we turn to research. In every context that we have studied, the first important thing to understand is that most people obey the law or rules most of the time. And that even goes for people who are what most of us might consider to be very serious offenders. So I wrote a paper a few years ago with Andrew Papachristos and Jeff Fagan, kind of jokingly entitled, "Why Do Criminals Obey the Law?" And we surveyed people who had spent serious time in prison for various serious offenses. And those people had the same attitudes about these procedural justice ideas as the folks in the surveys that Tom did around what we would call a general population, and actually cared even more about being treated with dignity and respect, which, if you think about it for about 10 seconds, it kind of makes sense. There's assumption that a person who would commit a very serious crime is breaking the law all the time. They're the people who are shoplifting, and they're the people who are running red lights, or they're just generally lawbreakers, and that's not true. And that's also true online. People who often break the rules or community standards online are not regular rule breakers. Often they do it on accident. They do it because they actually don't understand what the rules are, which is a reason for being transparent. Tell people what the rules are so that they actually know what to do. But of course, just like the folks in the general surveys, they care about being told how the rules apply. They care about having an opportunity to tell their side of the story, and so on. And you can get better results from that. And just like in a context in which you use too much deterrence-based approaches in policing, as we were talking about, if you adopt those approaches in an online context, you can alienate people. You can create distrust, and you're actually working counterproductively. So I guess the first thing I would say is that people should look at the science and see that their assumptions about the world being full of regular rule breakers who are who are bad actors multiple times over is just wrong. And so it just doesn't make sense to design a compliance system around a fact that actually doesn't exist. You want to add anything, Tom?
Well, I guess I would just say you can think of it as a balance between being too naive and trusting everybody, and being too risk averse and trusting nobody. And so if you don't believe that there are good people out there, then you won't seek their cooperation by appealing to their better nature. And what we find in all these systems, as Tracey said, is too much emphasis on treating everybody like they're a bad actor, and too little recognition of the fact that in reality, almost everybody is a good actor. And there's a very small group of bad actors. Just to use the criminal law, it's estimated maybe 5% of the population is people who really can't be effectively appealed to by appeals to their values. That means 95% of the people are the kind of people Tracey was describing. And if you treat those 95% of the people like they're bad actors, you essentially, as Tracey again said, you alienate them and you lose the possibility of gaining their cooperation through the values that they do have. So you'd be crazy, as we say, never to have any armed police officers in a community. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that every police officer have to approach every citizen as if they think they're a menace to society.
I'm listening to this, I'm working in the trust and safety field, and my response is, I think I get it. There's this way of thinking about the world that's deterrence oriented, that's almost like just keep punishing them harder until they obey, and if they don't, get them off the platform. And then there's this, sounds like, almost like the rules I learned in kindergarten. You know, just have fun a little bit, treat people in a way you'd want to be treated, explain things to them, etc. So maybe what I'm hearing is that I should be having two sets of policies in my company, segregate the good people from the bad people, treat the bad people really badly or really hard, and then the good people use procedural justice. So is that kind of what you're asking me to do, is initially segregate people and so that they don't touch each other, and so that, okay, I don't want to waste my energy using procedural justice on people who are, boy, they're just putting a lot of spam on the site, they're harassing people continuously, I can't reform them. But then there's all these good people, why would I ever want to turn them into bad people? I'm going to treat them nicely. What am I missing here? Are those two related in a way?
Not exactly. They are definitely related. One problem is you don't necessarily know who's who, but I'll get back to that. I think a natural analogy here would be to think about, public health. That is, you treat people in a group because in any particular instance, you're not sure, what you're dealing with. What I noticed is that you went straight to policy. One of the things that I think we've learned as we've applied these ideas in this space is that the policy people are maybe culturally influenced by lawyers and the perspective that Tom mentioned, like trying to figure out what is the exact appropriate policy. I think we've learned in our work in online spaces that it's really important to build a product in a way that is conducive to facilitating these ideas and these experiences, that people have online. So an analogy I like to use is, thinking about driving cars. Cars can be very dangerous technology, right? They can be really good technology. They get you where you want to go. They help you see your friends. They can get you someplace in an emergency. And if we think of what people say online, like a car, like words can be dangerous, but they can also be really good and helpful and help you manage emergencies and so on. The approach to thinking about the policy and finding the good people and the bad people is kind of akin to banning cars from the road and good drivers versus bad drivers. And you could do that, and sometimes you have to if people are really bad. But the better approach is to design a context for the cars to drive on so that people can interact safely. So if we think of early online, like the old 2-lane highway that our grandparents drive on, and every once in a while I find myself on one of these, it can be scary when you're trying to pass somebody on a 2-lane highway and the cars are going back and forth and so on. But a modern technology for cars to drive on is a 4-lane highway. Everybody on this side of the road can only go in one direction. Everybody on that can the other direction. There are rumble strips. There are lights on the highway and so on. And we've just created a context for the cars to interact with each other safely. That's the way we try to think of the application of our theoretical approach? Can we create an atmosphere for people, words, to interact safely where people can trust that atmosphere, in part because they trust the people who built it? I don't know if that it makes sense, if that was too much of a leap.
But keep going with that for a little bit, because you started by saying that I went first to policy. And if you're going to design and context, well, I gotta make rules. I have to have policies. When do they come in, and what's the best way to then bring them into the equation that you've seen in the online environment? What are good cases where policies actually end up serving the purpose that you want them to serve? Because it seems to me, if I don't get that right away, then there's gotta be rules.
Yeah.
Well, but so where do those rules come from, and how are they enforced? If we think that almost everyone on a platform is basically a good person and can be appealed to based upon a desire to do the right thing, then why don't we engage them in the process of creating the rules? Why don't we engage them in discussions when the rules are broken? That way we're trying to capture essentially the good sentiment within those people and to get them to trust the platform, to feel engaged with the platform, to feel the platform is listening to them, and they understand why decisions are being made because they help to create the rules and they participate in discussions about how to enforce them. So what you're doing is you're believing that almost everybody can be drawn into a system that they will buy into, the rules that they will see as legitimate, authorities that they will believe in, and then they'll be more what we would call self-regulatory. That is, they will be more motivated to follow the rules because they think it's the right thing to do, not because they're afraid of being thrown off the platform. So what you're doing is engaging as many people as possible in this constructive relationship. And if some people fall out of that and they really can't get on board, then over time, those can be the people that we manage in a different way. But we've captured 95% of users in a more cooperative relationship, which has the benefits that we just laid out.
Okay.
I can think of another example too. One company that we worked with, we helped them to think through understanding that their health problems existed on a spectrum. So in other words, one way of thinking about how the policy can be influenced is by having the policy itself be overseen by a theoretical approach. So our approach is procedural justice. We've talked about developing policy by looking to whether people are bad actors or good actors. But if you also understand that the process-based approach where you're engaging people necessarily means you need to have a spectrum for thinking about the problems that you're dealing with, where the bad actors are at one end, but also the people that you're just engaging in your online space might be just new to the space. So you need to have an educational component, you need to have a remedial component, and so on. It is the theoretical approach that has widened your policy lens in the first place and better integrated the policy with the product in the first place. I mean, that's a pretty abstract way of talking about it. I think I was as specific as I think I can be, but maybe later on you can be a little bit more specific if I wasn't specific enough. But I think that's a good way. And maybe the DTAG project that we did with Facebook is also an example of how this approach can influence policy.
When Matt and I were at Facebook, we enlisted both of you to help the company have a foundation to rethink rules and enforcement, particularly in our community integrity division, which was responsible for all the abuse types that were on the platform, from spam to terrorism to bullying, etc. And in addition to helping reframe our approach to enforcement, one of the outcomes was the Data Transparency Advisory Group. I think I'm getting that right, DTAG. And I believe that was we created that as an independent group of scholars that help us to release information on the abuse that was occurring on the platform, the negative experiences, in a more accurate way, that it felt like it had both goals for the outside world, disclosure, but it also felt like your motivation, the group's motivation, was an internal goal, that it was supposed to also help the company in the work that they were doing. Can you talk a little bit about why it was both an building capacity in the organization, as well as creating good effects for people who are using the services? What was that effort like, and why do you feel like it had effects for both Facebook and embracing transparency? Why did it have a good outcome for both the company and for the users?
Okay.
Well, I think you have to recognize, and we came to recognize, that there were a lot of different reasons that Facebook wanted to do DTAG. And one set of issues that weren't really central to the way we thought about what would be helpful is to manage external regulators. So like governments that wanted to regulate Facebook, and Facebook wanted to provide metrics that would convince external entities not to regulate the company. Subsequent to the DTAG report, the Supreme Court that Facebook came up with was another effort along the same lines. And then there was what I think we thought would be helpful to Facebook, which is to adopt the attitude towards their users that we've been talking about here today. I think it was clear to us from the research that we saw that most of the people who used Facebook at that time didn't really trust Facebook's motives, didn't feel Facebook treated them very fairly, particularly the people who had broken rules. And we were arguing that Facebook would be better off adopting a set of procedures for dealing with its users. You talked this morning about the user experience. To make the user experience feel fairer to the users, build up more trust in the company, and essentially create more of the kind of climate that we've been talking about in the last hour within Facebook in terms of the company's relationship to its customers. I think we thought that that was important. I'm not sure how much we convinced Facebook to change their corporate model, but I think part of the question you're asking is there really were two different issues here. There was the DTAG report as a response to Facebook's concern about external groups like the government, and then there was what we hoped we would accomplish by our work, and why we worked, Sudhir, with you, and why we worked with Matt, and what we were doing at Facebook was trying to cooperate to get Facebook to think more about behavioral science, just the way, as Tracey said, we've been cooperating to try to get law to think more about the implications of behavioral science when we design law.
I think I can add something else. And your point about external versus internal has an echo in our work in policing, which is, when you think about procedural justice, it's not only, we found lots of folks try to engage us when they have problems. I mean, which reflects what Tom was saying about Facebook. This is often true with policing agencies. They will engage us when there is a crisis. And usually the way they understand that crisis is some external relations problem. That is, the outside community that they're working with doesn't trust them. They've had some, big problem. And so they think about procedural justice ideas as a way that the agency treats the individuals outside the organization. But one of the things that Tom and I talk about a lot is that this is a theory that is general applicability. It's basic science. It works in every context. It works whether you're talking about companies, whether you're talking about schools, whether you're talking about police, courts, and so on, right? And so it's also incredibly important internally that the companies organize themselves around these ideas. And the other thing that Tom and I have argued is that it is very difficult to adopt for an agency or a company or a school or whatever, to adopt this orientation with respect to how they treat people outside the organization if they're not adopting it internally in terms of the way they treat the people who work there, and the ways they organize themselves. And that was actually another important thing that we tried to explain to the company, that, you know, a lot of the workers at that company who were dealing with abuse and so on, treating the users in certain ways, often felt that they weren't fairly treated, that they weren't listened to, that they had no input and no voice and so on. And we explained, yeah, that's what we see everywhere. And if you can actually adopt this thoroughgoing approach to how you organize yourself internally, how you treat people outside, how you work together within different groups in a company. This is why we always talk about product and policy and how they should be working together in certain ways. You'll get better outcomes all around. And so I think that was a really important idea that we tried to socialize. How successful we were, I don't know.
Zach asks, you know, he often describes trust and safety as a two-way street. And we've talked a lot about bad actors and bad versus good people on the platform. But he says, I think a lot of trust and safety teams lose that aspect of trust in their own users. And he's asking if you have advice of how teams and trust and safety teams might actually build more trust for their users. Or, you know, we've talked about a couple different ways, but I remember something you talked about, Tom, in the lab we're teaching, where we were talking about you guys did some police training, procedural justice training for police departments, and one of the things, I mean, you're welcome to answer this however you want, but I was struck by one of the things you said about that experience was one of the ways to get officers to act more procedurally just towards citizens was if they themselves within their organizations were treated with procedural justice, transparency,
Yeah.
voice, and fairness, etc. So, but you know, I wonder if you might have advice for someone like Zach who's working on a team who would like to think about how do we get people on our team to actually have and build more trust, because a lot of the things you're talking about building and architecting a system that invites more pro-social behavior, it's not really possible if you don't have a positive outlook towards the people using your platform.
So in the literature on management, there is a field of organizational justice. And one of the really interesting areas that's developed in the last 15 years is justice in teams, which directly responds, Matt, to the point that you're making, that many organizations now are built around work teams. And all of these principles of procedural justice that we've been talking about are really central to the ability of those teams to build up trust in one another, to work productively together. And so this just echoes the point that Tracey made, that procedural justice is not just about relationships with external constituencies, customers, or if you're a police department, residents. It's really about the internal dynamics of the organization that is dealing with some external constituencies. And I think probably the most interesting area of work in procedural justice and policing to me is this amazing finding that if you can change the internal dynamics of the police department so that the officers feel that they are treated fairly by their supervisors, by their chiefs, they just go out into the community and they treat people in the community more fairly. You don't have to tell them to do that. They just learn a style of dealing with one another and with authority that emphasizes fairness, and that's the way they approach people in the community. Similarly, if they feel that they're in a hierarchy that's based upon sanctions and it's based upon punishment for officers if they break rules, that's how they relate to people in the community. So
and they become really cynical when, when in the crisis context, the managers bring people like Tom and me in, to help think through what to do. And they're like, well, why should I do this when you're not treating me in a way that's fair?
I think this also highlights Sudhir, you set it up, our approach of these kind of three pillars. Later in the day, Doug is going to be talking us through how to build cohesive and productive and creative teams within an organization.
Yeah, and just maybe I'll just remind people out there, if you have particular kinds of questions for the organizations that you're in, send us those in advance too. With Tracey and Tom, we're thinking a lot, we work a lot with different kinds of organizations and always are attuned to the fact that whether it's offline or online, you're entering a culture where people have particular kinds of expectations, and some of them can be helpful and some of them are really great. There's a lot of empathy, there's a lot of interest in change, and some of them are hard because they pose points of friction, etc. I'm kind of curious to know when you have been working with tech organizations, and what are some common, common myths or beliefs. And here, let me just, for people who might be hearing this word, I'm using myth in the sense of a belief that people have, and it's often just hard to change your perspective because it's just so important. And I'll use one that I always use, which is, I know as a sociologist that the idea that working hard will get you ahead in society. As a sociologist, all we study is about how that myth is false, that we're in a stratified society and you're going to end up like your parents and blah, 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 blah. And yet I would never tell my 10-year-old kid not to work hard because he's going to end up like me, blah, blah, blah. Like, so despite the evidence, we believe what we want to believe. And I feel like we've talked about a lot of beliefs and myths that have that kind of feeling, like you kind of got to punish them harder. And I can understand procedural justice, but at the end of the day, I think I'd be nervous if I didn't assume that people are going to game the system all the time. I'm curious to know if there's other kinds of myths or other kinds of beliefs or other kinds of attitudes that you find are common challenges within companies and organizations that they kind of have to do a little bit of work on, and procedural justice will help them. But they are roadblocks or...
So one you've already mentioned, which is just the pervasiveness of the superiority of deterrence-based approaches that we see everywhere. And I actually, you reminded me of something in talking about the hard work and your concern about your son, which is, why is this so pervasive? There's another theory of social psychology that maybe Tom can mention, but motivated reasoning often underlies a lot of this. We'd have to think about, what is the motivation that would cause people to be so committed to deterrence. I can think of a few, but we can leave that aside for a moment. The second biggest hurdle, I think, to getting people to adopt these approaches that we've seen is this belief that they're different. And we've seen this everywhere, right? And when I say everywhere, I'm not just talking about online. So let me use our first example. So first of all, these theories have been established in a lab, through quote unquote the gold standard of science, experimental, like we actually know the mechanism. There's no black box. We literally know what people are thinking because that's what psychologists do, number one. And number two, we've got decades of research showing its effectiveness and its validity in court systems and so on. So Tom and I come to policing, and the policing researchers that we worked with, were convinced, well, it might work over there, but policing is different, and so we do what we do for a decade or so, and we show actually, no, it's not different, really. And Tom has worked in business schools, some of the best ones in the country, show that it works in the corporate setting. We see that it works in schools and so on. So then we come to online spaces and we explain that the science is solid and that it's deep and that it's broad and that it works in really tough contexts. Like policing is pretty much as tough as it can get. So you'd think that people would say, oh, if it works in policing, surely it will work online. But again and again, we will go to different companies and they'll say, oh, well, we're different, and it's like, well, are you human? because if you're human, you're not different. And then we have multiple experiments showing in different companies that it works. And then you then go to yet another company, and then they'll say, well, actually, it might work in that company, but we're different. And, at this point, I just throw up my hands and, we say, okay, we'll see. And, usually the great thing about science is it's science, and it typically goes our way. But I would say those two are the biggest ones, the deterrence one and the we're different one. I don't know if you have a different.
Well, maybe I'll just say a word about an idea that Tracey mentioned of social motivations. One of the reasons that hierarchy is so attractive to people is that everyone has this tendency to think of themselves as smarter, more capable, more intelligent, more able to solve problems than other people. And certainly then research suggests they actually are. And studies of hierarchy show that this feeling of superiority is enhanced when people are higher up in a hierarchy. So you have a group of people who have a lot invested in a set of beliefs about their own capacity, their moral capacity, their capacity to solve problems, that we find in a lot of research is typically exaggerated. So those people, what do they do when they have policies that don't work? To admit that you failed is to undermine your sense of superiority, which is a social motivation, a desire to feel that you're really capable and smart. So people tend to double down on failure. They tend to deny evidence. So that to me is another example of a myth that people have about themselves that impedes change.